brothers and sisters, and it is truly a pleasure to be here. I've been pretty lucky in my life. I've lived in 15 different states, in parts of Moscow, Russia, in Italy. I've been around the world, and I've seen all kinds of churches. And one thing that's really special about this place is the rootedness, the sense of family that's here. And I think a lot about Colin pointing to his ears, which means he can't quite hear me, I'm guessing. Is that right? Yeah. I'll talk a little louder. It'll be all right. But the rootedness, and it's really truly a blessing. And I think sometimes when you're in the midst of the things you're doing, I'm sure this happens with your families, it certainly happens with the stuff that I do with my life, it can get really easy to look at all the problems, to look at all the things that are going wrong and kind of forget the goodness that is being brought out. And even when you get celebrated for those good things, even when someone says, gosh, you're doing really good here, it doesn't feel quite right because you're still exhausted because of all the stuff you got to do. You still got to build a bathroom and get a water going to a coffee bar back there, right? And it can be kind of hard to maybe sometimes remember what this building looked like when we first got in here, you know. So what I want to talk with you today about, and Pastor Jason there was good. If you guys don't know me, if y'all don't know me, I am Evan. I used to be a park ranger at South Beach State Park where I met Pastor/Ranger Phil, and he brought me into this church community. One interesting thing about me that's a little odd is I'm getting a PhD in theology, but I'm also a Catholic. And rep for the Catholic, all right. That is really, really interesting because I think what is happening here that is interesting is we have varieties of Christianity that have a history of not getting along and oftentimes don't connect together. Having a chance to talk about something that is true, which is the love of Christ that binds us together. And one thing that I love about what Pastor Phil said there, I like calling him Pastor Phil because then I look at his face and he looks real, a little embarrassed by that. So one thing I like that Pastor Phil said there is doing everything in the name of Christ. And we're going to dive in today. We're looking at John chapter 8, starting at 12. And we're going to go through this disputation part here. And one thing that we're going to cue into is the idea of starting with gratitude and what happens when you don't do that. So this section, 8:12 to about 59 to the end of the passage, boy, I recognize this section in my life, and I hate this section in my life, I gotta be honest, because this is when Jesus has approached the temple, and he's giving his dissertation. He's giving his teaching lesson. He's giving his argument, and then he's doing the Q&A. And who here works either teaching, maybe lawyers out there, anybody, academics, anything like that? Good, okay. You've been spared a terrible experience, but I'm sure it's happened in your life. I'll describe it to you, and then you can let me know if the similar thing that's happened, which is sometimes you approach a microphone in front of a bunch of people that you don't know, who know absolutely as much about this subject as you do, probably a little bit more. And you have to talk for 20 minutes about the subject, and then you have to accept their questions. And sometimes those questions are very good, and they're very nice, and they're, hey, I'm supporting you, you're here. That's like maybe 5%, and that may be my own neuroses and nervousness about it, speaking there. But most of the time, you're at least going to get a handful of questions at the end of there, which are not coming from a good place, right? We call it point scoring, we can call it cutting down. Whatever it is, there are some people who will sit and listen to you talk, and I'm sure you've experienced in this life, and if we're honest, sometimes we are this person, and we're sitting there listening to, okay, what's wrong with what they're saying? What can I dig into and sound like I really know better than that, right? And it's even worse when this person is like maybe come out ahead in a dispute beforehand. Do you ever have that happen? How many arguments have you won in the shower about 20 days after the fight happened? Is that a regular thing it's terrible. I have won entire debates 20 days later, in the shower. And that we can identify, there's maybe a benign, there's an easy form of that, but there's some bitterness in that, right? There is at the end of the day the awareness of, maybe I wanted to make sure what I had was right because I think it was right. But maybe also I wanted to be right. And if I had just said this, I would have been right? Then everything would have worked great. So when we enter 8:12 here, Jesus is at the temple, and he's about to start preaching, but he's going to do this Q&A. Now, you have to remember, just before this, right, is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And so you had all of these Pharisees, you had all these figures, and Pharisees I'm going to get into. I understand Pharisees maybe a little too well, to be honest with you. Pharisees come and say, what do you do with this woman caught in adultery? We all know this story. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And then everybody goes away. So Jesus won that dispute. And I gotta believe, and you gotta imagine, there's a couple of those Pharisees who are disputing Christ in the temple right here, who saw that woman caught in adultery thing and didn't really pay attention to having compassion for the woman. Because let's be honest, now I live in San Francisco, so I will own it on my own side, and then you can fill in the details as you want there. Sometimes, as I pass my 6th homeless person who's bent over with fentanyl, it can sometimes be hard for the people who are excluded, who we are used to walking away from, to recognize their humanity. And if a Pharisee or two, you could imagine, was there that day, they probably never even saw the woman with adultery. But they did see Christ winning the argument. If I'm a Pharisee, if I make my money, if I make my bread, if I make my teaching based on my ability to bring people to thinking that I know the truth, to saying the truth, to speaking the truth, that is how I make my bread. This guy Christ, he's saying something different from mine. I lost that interchange. I got to go do something about this. That brings me back to what Pastor Phil was saying a little earlier there, which is doing everything in the name of Christ. Another way we can look at that is, where do we begin our approach to life, to other people? Now, everything I've just described about what the Pharisees are going on there, I think is in the scriptures there. If I'm going a little bit far on one side or the other, clavered in, just pray for forgiveness, and I hope Christ gives you what is actually supposed to be said there. But I will say that we can see that these questions that the Pharisees are going to dispute Christ over are not coming from a place of good intent. And our job is to approach every situation with some sense of gratitude. Because however bad it is in the world, however bad the things are, however many bathrooms you have to renovate, however many tasks, however many fights you've had with your family today, however many things you can point to in your life this week and next week that you're sitting there going, man, I wish my knee didn't ache. I wish I had a better relationship with this person. I wish that fight wasn't just so darn hard. All of those things, even at the worst, we woke up this morning. We woke up to a beautiful day. We woke up, and I mean, we woke up on the coast of Oregon, folks. There is a reason to start with gratitude. And when we approach people with that attitude of approaching with gratitude, then the questions that we ask can be good questions, can help us learn and grow, but we always honor the other person. We're about to see the Pharisees and the Jews. They are not honoring Christ. And that's what I want us to focus on. Now let me break that apart a little bit. Join with me. We get to John chapter 8, verse 12. Here's a famous passage. Here's one of those. You can see Jesus is approaching. He's approaching the mic, well, metaphorically speaking. He's in front of the temple there, and there's some evidence we have from the commentaries that Jesus is speaking right near this massive lamp that hung over the temple. So when Jesus says to us, again he spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. You can feel the resonances there. If you know your scriptures, you can feel the resonances. It's the light that lights up the temple. In other words, the place that we live, the place that we find God, is illumined by what Christ does. All of this mystery of the meaning of life that we have, when we look at Christ, it is lit up. We also have the image of the pillar of fire, if you know from the story of the Israelites wandering in the desert, this pillar of fire, this light in the darkness that led you forward. And one little element that I really like when I think about this bit here is Christ says that he is the light, and those who follow him will not walk in darkness. I like that because and I wonder how many of you can agree with this, am terrible at just stopping at looking at Christ. Because I see Christ is the way, and the path is clear towards Christ every point in my life. But then I kind of want to lean a little bit to the side and say, okay, Christ, but where are you leading me to? And Christ's answer is always back to me. But yeah, I know that. I know, but, I'm working on a PhD right now, and I don't have a lot of money. Like, when's going to be my next job is what I mean, Christ. When is that financial thing going to be fine? When am I going to find my romantic partner? When is my romantic partner and I going to have a kid? Or when are my kids going to go to this, go to that? What's the next step? And Christ does not say, I am the light of the world. Those who follow me will know the game plan and the 10-year plan that's going to occur and what to do there. They just know it's going to come back to Christ. I like that. But of course, this is not what the Pharisees are thinking. Even that, in a way, brings you back to Christ. The Pharisees, they have a great question. I don't know if y'all read this. The question that the Pharisees bring is, you are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I read that, I was really confused about what the Pharisees were talking about. I am the light of the world. Cite your source. What is going on here? How do those two things compare? This conversation on the surface didn't seem to connect as how I understood it, right? Because how do you debate? If I say to you, or if Christ says to you, I am the light of the world, you shall not walk in darkness, that seems more like a metaphor, or it seems like an allegory. It seems like something that is speaking to truth, but in poetic language. And usually we don't think about poetic language as requiring you to show who testifies, who has authority, or who, in other words, you are citing. If I put this in language today, it would be something like the Pharisees saying, cite your source. Okay, what study do you have? What institute are you from? You say that you have the wisdom of truth. You say that you are the light of the world, that those who follow you will walk in glory, will walk in life. Okay, so what school did you go to? Okay, so where did you get your studies published? What psychologists are you using? Who speaks for your method being effective? Or are you just some guy talking? Seems to be what the Pharisees are saying. Now that is fascinating because the Pharisees in this section are going to discredit Christ in three ways. And this is the first. And it's the one that connects the most to this idea of starting with gratitude. Because that is not a bad question. That's kind of a good thing, especially from a Pharisee who's kind of, in my mind, a little bit like a teacher or a judge. They really work to understand the law. They're kind of a lawyer there. It's important. Hey, it's a good thing to make sure that the person you're listening to has some reason, some vetting. Where are you coming from? Let me understand you, right? First way that people are going to try and discredit Christ, and hint, hint, when you share your faith, this may be one way that people try and discredit you. One of the things they might do is they might use really reasonable arguments, not just reasonable sounding, but reasonable arguments, but coming from what we might call, looking to my father who's the lawyer or post-lawyer, bad faith arguments. Am I using that term right? No. It's a bad faith place because they don't really care where Christ is getting his authority. He tells them they don't care. What they care about is figuring out how to discredit him because they want to dismiss him. And if you find yourself in a place where you are sharing your faith and you are entirely sure that the person who you are talking to is just waiting to point out where you are wrong, that's going to be a hard place to share the gospel because they're not starting from a place of gratitude. They're not starting from a foundation of faith. They are just looking to be right. And Christ does some great things here. I'm looking at my time. I won't go through all the fancy footwork, but basically what Christ does in his answer is he goes and meets the Pharisees where they're at. He basically goes through their logic. But what he says is, I come from the Father. My power. And one thing that I think is really powerful in what he says here, I'm on 14. Even if I do bear witness about myself, my testimony is true, for I know where I came from and where I am going. I know where I came from and where I am going. You know, that's the thing that I find often. I don't know if you find this as well, but when you find somebody who is arguing with you not for the reasons of finding the truth, but to be right, or for their own reasons, when they're entering that argument or they're entering that discourse, that dispute on bad faith, they don't really have a clear articulation of why they're there, where they're going, or where they're from. Because it's not about authenticity in that case. It's about winning. And here, Christ says, this is where I'm coming from. I know where this is going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Now, this is going to be interesting because we're going to see in the dispute here that judgment is going to happen, that Christ is going to form some judgments. But what I like if you read this passage is that Jesus did not come to judge. Now, when he's talking to the Pharisees and he comes to dispute with them, he is going to give some Pharisaical judgments. But I love how he starts this because he says, this is not what I'm here to do. But if this is the only way I can communicate with you, okay, I'll play this game. I'll play this ball, right? And that's the first thing he does. He goes through and he discredits them by basically saying, you're not even looking for the Father. You're not even looking for the source of truth. You're just looking to be right. Now 21, let's skip forward a little bit. This is going to be the second way. I said that I'm going to talk about 3 ways that in these disputes, they attempt to invalidate him and he responds. The first, the Pharisaical way, right answer or right critique, right question, bad faith and wrong reasoning behind it. And I think that's one of the hardest ones, and honestly, as someone who works in teaching, it's one I hear a lot. Having been a post-high school teacher with teenagers, I am very familiar with these kinds of arguments. It is always fun when I'm like, you are technically correct, and yet I know we are having this conversation not for the case of the argument. We are, yes, beautiful. 14-year-olds are fabulous people. Anyway, so let us go to the next example here. 21. Christ says, I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come. Well, that's heavy. Usually, Christ is a little bit more gracious, we think. What I like is he does walk through this. Now, I'm going to give what the Jews said. I'm going to do the whole thing here. So the Jews said, 22, will he kill himself since he says, where I'm going, you cannot come? He said to them, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I told you that you would die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. So we have here that Christ is not, maybe for those who like to study a little bit of theology here, Christ doesn't seem to be making a prophecy about the future of these guys' souls definitively. We're not in a case of predestination kind of arguments there. Any Calvinists in the room? You know, we can take a cup of water. What Christ seems to very clearly be talking about here is the fact that you cannot, by just worldly reasoning, which is largely the overarching thing that is happening here. If you're just thinking in an earthbound way, you're never going to get to heaven. There is nothing that is going to lead you to where Christ is going to bring us. Christ is not of this world. There is something truly beyond. And I look at this room, and one of my favorite quotes, all right, I promised my dad I wouldn't do too much church history or ancient patristic theology. I'm going to just say one thing, all right. There's a guy named Ambrose of Milan. I call him St. Ambrose of Milan because, Catholic. He, 4th century, and he would do baptismal rites. I see you have a sign out for baptism. I hope you get some people baptized. But in the 4th century, how they did baptism is they really wouldn't explain much of it. Once you were ready theologically, they wouldn't explain the ritual. You just go through the baptism first. And then afterwards, you would have what were called the mystagogic sermons. And mystagog means mystery. It would be the sermons that reveal the mystery of what you went through. And St. Ambrose would talk about, one of his great quotes in one of those sermons is, Did you not know there were angels walking amongst your midst while you were within the church? You look around this room right now. There's nothing materially in this room that differentiates it from having sort of a mild enthusiasm for lectures and speaking on spiritual topics that, you go to weekly. That people do that. I live in San Francisco. People do that. Like, that's just a thing. But here we are, and do you not know there are angels in your midst in this church? Do you not know there is a king here? Because this is where a king likes to hang out on Sundays. But the Jews, and you hear this difference in that language there, and we're not getting into anti-Semitism here, but there's a clear reason why in the second argument he goes from the more critical Pharisees, the more narrow definition of who's asking the questions. That's the teachers, the lawyers, the disputers, the academics, the people who scare me when I go to conferences. He goes to the Jews. And that is the larger group talking here. That's the idea, is this is the general people who are talking. And the general people do the second thing that often invalidates, which is completely misunderstanding the whole darn thing and just running with it. And boy, howdy does this happen a lot. We have an entire, I'm not going to talk, I always promised my dad no politics, but we have an entire political mainframe in some ways that more or less, part of it, we can agree, runs on hearing a tweet and making that the whole news cycle for the week. Jesus says, I am going away, and you will seek me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come. And they hear those words. And if we sit with those for a little bit, we get into this idea of, well, Christ is coming from a supernatural place. There's the idea that there's more than the material that's coming here. Maybe we need to meditate spiritually, understand that we need to become more fully human to understand who Christ is. We understand that as Christians because we're sitting meditating on it for a little bit. But the people who were first hearing this went, is he talking about killing himself? And then the tweets start going. Can you feel them? Can you feel the chatter going on over here, the chatter going on over there? And then Christ has to say, you are from below. You're not thinking about this. You're just chattering. So first way to validate, actually good arguments, then maybe not presented in good faith. Second is just not taking the time to really understand what's being said. It's important in our spiritual lives, y'all. And again, I'm using a lot of theological words. If you want to know what you should do at the end of this sermon, if any of this penetrates into changing your life in any way, shape, or form, take 15 minutes each day and pray. That's what you got to do. Because what happens if you don't is oftentimes John chapter 8, about 21 through 22. That's what happens. You hear the words, but we don't take the time to let them get from here and here to here. And then suddenly, whatever is the good of the message, we misunderstand. And that kind of misunderstanding is honestly even worse than never hearing, because you think you know what he's talking about, and then you run with it. And that, it's almost bad. I mean, there's that old phrase, sometimes having a little knowledge is a lot worse than having none at all, because you can actually do some damage with a little knowledge. So that's the second there. Now, the third bit that goes on here, we have to understand, we're going to jump ahead to 39. Kind of have to understand the Pharisee mindset that was going on here is that how were you saved according to sort of the Judeo-Pharisaical, the Jew-Pharisee kind of thing, culture here? What would a Pharisee say? How do I get light? How do I get truth? And they would say, well, the truth, faith, our religion, comes from two sources. One is the disputation of the law, right? One is following, disputing, understanding, and enacting the law, right? And we saw that within the first response. We saw your testimony is invalid because you have no witness. It's a legal claim, a legal argument. We saw in the middle kind of the average person's response. And then the third, what's going to start happening is we start talking about these sons of Abraham and that we're children of Abraham. Well, that's the second side, is it's who are your people, right? Who do you come from? And I think, we're Americans, And I think this argument does not exist as much in the American context. It may, you can dispute on this with me a little bit, but this pedigree and this sense of being of the people was a very strong idea during this section. It's why 2 of the Gospels start with genealogies, for instance. That's Matthew and Luke. What Christ says here is very interesting. But before I get there, because we'll get there, one thing I do want to point out that Christ says, because I think it is a very, very important thing, is that when he's talking about Abraham being free there. Well, let me collect my notes here. Sorry, folks. Problem of not preaching as often as I'd like to. This third dispute, the third angle that goes wrong, is that the Pharisees say to the Jews, the Pharisees say to him that he is from the devil. And that is the third discrediting. And I'm looking through my passages to make sure I get where this is. You are your father, the devil. Abraham is our father. They said to him, we're born. Oh, yes, here it is. The Jews, this is 48, answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? And we feel the 2 prongs of that. First, it's the third way of discrediting, which is not just mishearing and running with it. It's authentically misrepresenting. This is not what Christ has said. And so you're putting on this person, taking claim and saying, no, this is who you are. Aren't we right in saying this is who you are? And it's interesting that he gets attacked on those 2 levels. He gets attacked spiritually, and he gets discredited for his genealogy. And those would be the 2 markers against. What's really interesting about this entire passage, and I'll kind of leave with this before binding us into what does this all mean for our lives. We've got in this disputation, this is Jesus responding to his critics. And this entire section is beautifully developed to, 1, teach us about how people will try to discredit faith so we can be aware of it. And 2, show us the arc that ends in this final statement, which is found in 58. We build up ratcheting tension, starting with, I'll give you the right argumentation, maybe the wrong reason, but I'm going to argue with you in a reasonable way, to I'm going to hear what you're saying, but I'm going to misunderstand it, to, okay, now I'm going to misrepresent what you're saying. We can see the ratcheting of the problems and Christ responding and responding until at last we get to the revelation of who Christ was, who Christ is. I truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Now, of course, church, we know when the words I am are said here, this is more than just him saying, I am a pretty good guy who lives right now. Abraham. Well, that's not in my scriptures. Randy, are we getting bored with the sermon here? Or? I only got 2 minutes left. I don't know what you... Downstairs. Good. Sorry. Good cue, though. So, with that, we get the ratcheting attention before I am. And as we know, church, when Christ is saying that, he's representing the name of God. The divine name, Adonai is what I'll say there, 4 letters, Yod-He, Vav-He, that means I am. And what Christ is doing here is this is really strong for our theology. It is the case that we have that God the Father and God the Son act together. They have been together since the foundation of the universe. Now, just a piece there of if you've ever wondered why this Trinitarian theology is important, why try and stone this guy for saying that? It's not something we would necessarily do today, right? We might get somebody psychologically evaluated if they start saying that they are the creator God of the universe. We may have some questions about how they're working with that, but we probably wouldn't pick up rocks, right? Why is this important? And more importantly, why is it important that we hold to this idea that Jesus Christ, who is present with us within the Eucharist and within our prayers and within our lives as we go forward, within our scriptures that we read here, was historically present as a figure in the first century Why is it important that that is God the Father? Well, one important theological thing to think about is this very idea of authority, which is if Christ came later, if Christ is not fully God, we don't really have any full assurance of that infinite, ineffable, incomprehensible God. My father and I were having a conversation about this, and we were talking a little bit about heaven. I do have a good relationship with my father. We talk about heaven, go surprise. But what we talked about was the fact that God is infinite, incomprehensible. You never get to the end of God, right? But God is also coherent. What we mean is that what you hear about God here in these scriptures, about the truth, and the truth that Christ tells us here sets us free. What we hear there is going to hold through all eternity. There's never going to be a moment where God contradicts himself. There's never going to be a moment that what we learn here does not carry on to our eternal life with God. And the reason we can be sure of that is because Christ is more than a messenger. Because messengers, as we see in this passage, well, one, they can get things wrong. Two, they may present the truth, but for their own reasons. And three, they may misrepresent the truth for their own power. We are given the three reasons in this passage why Christ being just a messenger of God and not God himself isn't going to work for us. Instead, though, we get to the end of this passage, and we are confronted with the fundamental question of Christianity. Either Christ is God, or he is not. There's no way to slide out of that in discourse and disputation. Either Christ is God, or he is not. And I think, as we go forward this week into the future, into your next weeks, where I will be praying for you down in San Francisco, and Lord, help me, please be praying for me. Perhaps one of the meditations we can have as we look at this dispute is confronted with Christ as the truth. And that truth is that he is God. How does that change your life? If you spend 15 minutes meditating on that, if Christ truly is God, and if Christ truly is in this building with us, and truly is present in your prayers, how does that change your life this week? Hopefully, it means doing more of the good things you are already doing. But maybe a focus on that might be our message for today. May God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for listening to my little teaching on John 8. Pray for me, and we will see you next time I'm in town.